Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Byington, and in this video, I'm giving you a sort of brief introduction of the history of the 18th century. I'm looking at it and discussing it mostly as how it pertains to literature, since I teach literature courses and not specifically history. Um, I would say this would be on an exam. It's a pretty easy question, hint, hint, if you're a student in my class. But also, it's just good for you to know in general if you're just a random person coming across this video. So, usually, the rule of thumb is that, let's say I say something like the 14th century. That would generally mean 1300 through 1399, if we're talking about CE, Common Era, right? So that rule doesn't apply exactly when we are talking about the 18th century, quote unquote, the 18th century, as a matter of fact, because we're looking at it uh, we're trying to use a term that's inclusive of all of the arts, the public reforms, the changes in society, and so on. All these things. Let me show you what monarchy changes, how society's perspective changes at the time, changes in the sciences, and then that in literature as well. So we usually call this the long 18th century. So look, it's if you say 18th century, you're not wrong if you're talking about something happening 1700 through 1799. But if we're talking about this era and all the changes, all those things I just showed you on the slide, then we need to refer to it as the long 18th century, and that begins all the way back in 1660, and technically most people cut it off at 1785. If you go on to study what most universities call English literature two or British literature two, where I teach, we call it British literature after 1785. I'm making this video for a course called British Literature to 1785. 1785 marks the beginning of, in literature, anyways, in the arts, the Romantic, with a capital R, period. So you see it that when we say the long 18th century, it doesn't even go all the way to 1799. So I know that's a little confusing, but there's this pocket of time going on there when we're including 1660. That is called the Restoration. So if you're using the Norton textbook, it calls it the Restoration and 18th century. Um, the Restoration is referring to the restoration of the monarchy because, as you'll see in the slide I'm about to go to about changes in the monarchy, it didn't work out so well for a while after Elizabeth I was reigning, way back when we were talking about Shakespeare and all his contemporaries in my other videos. So, you had the House of Stuart before the long 18th century. That's who came. James the First is the guy who came after Elizabeth the First. So when we were talking about the English Renaissance, or more commonly referred to as early modern literature, um, that then she's followed by James the First. I don't spend a lot of time talking about him in my courses, but well, specifically the ones I teach right now, anyways. That could change, but he's the guy who was obsessed with demonology and witch hunts and stuff like that. Um, we go on to have. I'm gonna move this window a little bit because I don't know how it's gonna show up in the recording. We go on to have another king after him, his son, Charles the First. And the people hated Charles the First. They hated him so much that he was convicted of high treason. He was executed. When the executioner beheaded him at, like at a public execution, and everyone's like, rah, cheering on, because that was like their version of Netflix back then, to go watch executions in Smithfield Market, like I talked about in the Anne Askew video. The executioner saved one of the vertebra, like one of those bones in your spine that protects your spinal cord. Saved one of those, and it was used as a salt shaker by the guards in the Tower of London all the way until the Victorian era, so like about mid 1800s ish, approximately. And when Queen Victoria found out, she was appalled and had that one little lone vertebra cleaned, and it was interred with the rest of Charles I's remains. And I don't mean to go off on like a true crime morbid tangent there about that, but I feel like that's a pretty good example to tell you like how off the tracks things get after Elizabeth I and James I are ruling. Um, they after Charles I is ruling, well, he has a son, Charles II, who should technically be king, but because it's just all this public upheaval of the English Civil War, um, he flees to the continent. He flees to Europe, and he stays there until 1660, that date you just saw on the other slide for the restoration of the monarchy. So the rule of the Commonwealth, this is kind of the best way I would compare this to something modern and would be like the English Parliament, or excuse me, the United Kingdom's Parliament that they have today, because this is also when you get the beginning of the Tories and the Whigs. That's basically their Conservative Party and Liberal Party. So later, though, after it doesn't work out with these other people, with Oliver Cromwell and then his son, straight up nepotism. Um, and there wasn't, okay, they were protectorates too, by the way. They were not prime ministers. You don't have the first prime minister until about 1720 and 21. That's Walpole. You may have seen his name before or read about him because he's the first prime minister of Parliament. And that's worth mentioning, since you start to get that structure that you can see as we are becoming modern over time. They start to have structures and government that we can recognize. It looks like the way here in the States, where I teach this course, where we recognize this is the way things kind of work today. Moving on, some of these views at the time. So I already mentioned the thing about the Tories and the Whigs. You have even once Charles II comes back to the throne, like, and it's not like he forced his way back. The people were so over this crap with the English Commonwealth that didn't work out under the Cromwells that there was just like lots of applause and a parade of just happiness when he does return and restores the monarchy. And you have that whole thing, that whole bit with Parliament kind of staying there and the structure continuing to develop, because like I said, a few more decades on, you're going to have the first prime minister Parliament. So this also kind of affects the views of religion, and it's kind of like what you might recognize now as a separation of church and state. I'm not going to say that that's what this was that was developing exactly, but instead of like everybody who's not committed to whatever the state religion is, because it kept changing back and forth over time, right? Like before Elizabeth I, it was her sister, quote unquote, Bloody Mary, who executed tons of Protestants or anyone who wasn't Catholic. And then Elizabeth takes the throne, and she's had the Church of England because she's queen. And so basically, if you're Catholic or anything else that doesn't say this, the Church of England / Protestantism is the be all end all, then you don't necessarily get executed. She wasn't as nasty about that as Mary was, but people would still not be able to live a normal life, and you could be executed. Um, but that whole like back and forth flip-flopping and the extremes of you must believe in this or you must believe in that, that starts to fade into the background. And there's more of a focus of obedience to the crown than just saying like you must be Catholic or you must be Protestant, you must be committed to the Church of England, like whatever, again, whatever the state religion is at the time, depending on who is ruling. So you see that kind of change. And also, there is this just general capacity of empathy that really develops. You have what you might call the beginnings of public health. So, if you studied anything in the field of public health, you know that can include a kind of wide range of things. But the general commitment of public health workers is that we're trying to better the health and the safety and the hygiene, like better the quality of life of people. And then also we have some things here, like I have listed hospitals for foundlings. So if someone had a child out of wedlock and they're not going to keep it because they're going to be shunned by society, um, to leave a baby on a doorstep, a foundling, happened a lot. So instead of just throwing them all in orphanages, and they started to improve the conditions of those places. Now they still are not exactly the standards that we have today, but it's getting better. They're trying. Also, this bit about housing for penitent prostitutes. So, yes, but also the whole bit about prostitution is that approximately 1 in 5 women living during the long 18th century was assumed to have been a sex worker at some point in her life. Why? Not because they're all like out there being thirsty, because this the only thing that you could do to provide for your family. You can't just stand in the market like My Fair Lady and sell flowers all day. If your husband died and you were a widow and you had no money left from him, or he had a lot in debts and you had children, it happened a lot. And I'm connecting that to this bullet point of like, oh, that wasn't something that public health came along and improved. It was just that women who were working as prostitutes would have been maybe a little less likely to be punished as extremely because it's just like, well, what other choice does she have? And we also have the matter of the attempts of abolishing slavery. Now, when you read, if you ever take the British literature after 1785 course, in the beginning of the Romantic period, you have a lot of essays about that from former slaves like Mary Prince, who had been a slave in, I believe, Bermuda, and she talks about like the extreme circumstances in which she had to labor day and night, having all these sores and blisters on her legs, working in the sugarcane, uh, with the water up to her knees, and then her master brought her to England, not realizing that once she was there, she would be free because they had abolished slavery. And so she becomes a free woman because he was an idiot, and so she was able to take advantage of his stupidity, of his ignorance, and not knowing that that would happen. So the other thing about some other what we now look at as everyday human rights. Um, Maybe not so much the ability for everyone to act on the stage, because some of us are a little more introverted than that. But women are now allowed to act on the stage. So the view shifts that, like previously, they didn't want women acting on the stage because to them in the past, it equaled like the same thing as prostitution because the male gaze can be on them and they are somehow, even if they're fully clothed and doing things that are modest and not inappropriate, that somehow putting themselves like in the eyes of other men, and it was considered the same as prostitution, basically. Um, so on that matter, the theaters also reopened because even back during Shakespeare's time, when we're talking about the late 1500s and into the very early 1600s, there was still a tug of war with that puritanical stuff of like, no, we don't want theaters because that's where they get all their liberal ideas and they keep trying to progress society and we don't like it. They kept trying to close the theaters all the time. Um, Eventually that did happen with all that chaos that was going on. That 1642 was 1 year before the whole English Commonwealth bit happened. So you have the theaters closing then, but then reopening when Charles II comes back to the throne with the restoration of the monarchy. And he is the one who decided women can act on the stage. And you know what? Some of this influence comes from two things. One being, I'll talk about Nell Gwynn in just a second, the name on the bullet point there, but also um, he when he went into hiding, he went to Europe and just their culture is always just a little bit more progressive than the States, than the UK, as far as these types of things go in the arts. And women were acting on the stage. You could go see a play, and it wasn't a big deal. So he came with that mindset of like, well, we could have the arts and people could have entertainment. And so theater, drama becomes a huge thing in 18th century literature. In a full blown 18th century literature course, you would be reading a lot of plays. And they are so funny because the comedy in it is very much like what you would watch in a comedy series on any kind of streaming service or broadcast now. And the other reason is because Charles II, like pretty much every monarch we could assume, thought, well, it's good to be king, and had some mistresses. And there is even actually a Wikipedia page about the mistresses, just the mistresses of Charles II, because not just the quantity, but apparently the quality, because his mistresses were pretty famous women. One of them being this name here on the bullet point, Nell Gwynn. She was a very famous actress, and probably like his most well-known mistress. And it's believed she is the one who convinces him, you've got to let women, you've got to change the law and let women act on the stage because if you want to keep being with me, um, this has got to change. Okay, so some of these other things relative to literature, I'm going to say that in the sciences, some of our most important things here. So first, let me say something about the Royal Academy. Royal Academy is, well, it's an academy, but it's, your top shelf, this would be your top shelf scientist. And I think you could maybe kind of compare this to, and there's also a Royal Academy of Arts too, by the way. You could kind of compare this to it being like, when we say something is peer reviewed. So if I write a peer reviewed essay to for it to be published, I don't just hand it to some friends of mine I teach with, like my name is removed. It's sent to people who are considered top shelf scholars of whatever that topic is in their field. And that my field, the one I'm writing about, the one we're all that those people are helping shape. So they're like the pioneers of that field. And it's not whether they say, oh, this is impossible, this can't work. They tell you like what isn't working in the research usually. So that is how peer review kind of works, and that whole concept of the Royal Academy is kind of a forerunner of shaping that process, where we have in the sciences especially, but also in the humanities and other types fields of study, you would have people looking at this and approving it before it's research that becomes part of the public or mainstream ideas. So we don't have like conspiracy theories getting through the holes, right? Okay, two other things here. The microscope, and I also want to point to the stuff about Sir Isaac Newton here, and mentioned in two bullet points. So the microscope, there were versions of it before, but it was just kind of considered this novelty thing. Like, oh, you can put some dirty water from the Thames River in here, and oh my gosh, there's some scary stuff in here when you look at it under a microscope. But now they can start to take it seriously and realize, oh, we can see things better. We can see things more clearly. We can develop a better understanding of um, things that have to do with health and hygiene, things like bacteria and viruses and such. And that whole bit of like seeing more, you get that from Sir Isaac Newton as well. Specifically, I want to point to um, his little essay excerpt about the spectrum of light. So he's basically talking about when you take a prism and you see the spectrum of light, the Roy G. Biv spectrum, all of the colors in light. So he kind of breaks that down. And then we also have the beginnings of electricity. And it's so interesting to people. It's new, and it's not just about illuminating. Well, that would be another bit. Having light sources when it's dark, something where you can see a little better with light bulbs as opposed to a bunch of candles. And so the candles are a fire hazard. So we have more light and you can see more with that as well. But also, that's one of my favorite things from the Norton Anthology. Talks about how this was a party novelty in the beginning, where people would electrocute themselves with small little electronic devices. In literature, we have a sort of transition through the long 18th century of how these things are, how the world is portrayed. Early on, we have sort of something that's more interested in looking at what's fitting or right. So things about morals, but it's not writing it in a sense to be moral. It's so often questioning what are morals, what is morality. And then we get into more of the comedy stuff, not just in dramas, but you also get satire. Jonathan Swift is one of the biggest names of that. And then later, we're going to have some of the earliest forms of like solidifying things that we would recognize in our world today. So, how people talk about like, I can't understand stuff that Shakespeare wrote or things written from that time. The English isn't all the same as modern English now. Well, no, and spelling of words is sometimes not even always the same. Um, in the latter end of the long 18th century, we get our first official dictionary, and that kind of helps solidify the English language. Okay, that's the last bit for this video, kind of looking at the 18th century and its relationship to literature. Thank you for watching.